Well, thank you, Michael. My father is a tough act to follow, and you've just reminded people of that. The title of my speech to you today is Our Broken Democracy. It's just a title. I might have chosen a different word. I might have said our dilapidated democracy, our depressing democracy, our faintly ridiculous democracy. But I think broken is actually more apt than perhaps any of us wants to believe. No democracy is perfect. People in every country complain about the faults in theirs. But somewhere along the way, I think ours crossed some kind of line. Put plainly, we no longer live in the system we think we do. We have the form of a parliamentary democracy, to be sure, but not the substance. No, we have not become a tyranny. We do not fear the midnight knock on our door. But if government is not our master in this country, neither is it wholly our servant. Some of the problems with our system are long-standing and well-known. Others are more recent vintage. But the failings are profound and across the board, from the conduct of our elections to how we count the votes to the way that Parliament works or doesn't work. We should beware, of course, of falsely idealizing how politics used to be in this country. There never was any golden age. But we should be equally steer clear of the lazy assumption that it's always been this way. It hasn't. It's worse now. I don't mean this as necessarily a commentary on recent political controversies or an indictment of any one party. The dismantling of Canadian democracy is a glittering bipartisan achievement. And while I'll spend most of my time talking about the federal domain, much of this applies also to provincial politics. So allow me, if you will, to raise the alarm at the state of our broken, dilapidated, depressing, ridiculous democracy. But let's start with a pretty clear warning signal: voter turnout. Turnout in federal elections has been on the decline for more than 20 years. In the 16 elections from 1945 to 1993, turnout averaged nearly 75%. In the 6 elections since then, it has averaged just 62%, and that's of registered voters. As a proportion of the voting age population, we're getting close to the 50% line. We can't be sure of the reasons for this, of course, and other countries have also experienced some declines in turnout. But if I had to speculate, well, when the prospective voter looks at the candidates in his riding, what does he see? He sees creatures of the parties, dependent utterly on the approval of the party leader, who has, after all, to sign their nomination papers. Perhaps the voter is interested in where the candidates stand on the issues, but it doesn't really matter what the candidates stand for, because all policy is set by the parties. And it doesn't really matter what the parties stand for, because at any given time they generally stand for the same thing, and because whatever they stand for today, they will stand for its opposite tomorrow. When the voter watches the election campaign, what does he see? He sees campaigns dominated by attack ads, photo ops, attack ads, and news coverage focused on polls, gaffes, and discussions of strategy, mostly about attack ads. Then the votes are counted, and what does he see? He sees a parliament that looks nothing like what voters cast their ballots for, with a distribution of seats between the parties bearing no resemblance to the division of opinion in the country. He sees that the MP he elects has no real role or responsibility but to stand up and sit down when he's told. He sees a parliament that has very little ability to hold governments to account. He sees that all power effectively resides in the office of the Prime Minister. And every day, he sees a politics dominated by coarseness, cynicism, and mindless partisanship. A viciousness made all the more stupefying for the absence of real divisions among the parties. If politics generally can be defined as people behaving badly for good reasons, our politics involves people behaving appallingly for no reason at all. And you ask, why doesn't he vote? Frankly, the only mystery in all this is why so many people still do. Indeed, if we in the media were writing about a third world country with a system like ours, we'd be careful to refer to its largely ceremonial parliament and sham elections. Only force of habit prevents us from applying the same terms here. Do I exaggerate? Well, let's go into some of these issues in more detail. And let's start with the issue that more than any other comes up in surveys as the reason people don't vote: trust, or to give it its proper name, lies. Politics has never been noted as a place for unsparing honesty. At best, it consists of telling people what they want to hear. It deals in shades of truth, selective facts, exaggeration, blarney, and spin. But in most places, at most times, it's been expected that politicians will stay within some kind of limits. Equivocate if you can, mislead if you must, but don't say straight up in a manner that's intended to believe something that you know is false. Or as a corollary, don't promise something that you know you will not be able to keep. But somewhere along the way, that taboo was broken in Canada. Perhaps it began with Pierre Trudeau, who campaigned against wage and price controls up and down the country in the 1974 election, only to introduce them shortly afterward. There followed Brian Mulroney, who upbraided John Turner for his patronage sins as if he were not himself about to take the practice to new depths. Jean Chrétien, who promised to abolish the GST and negotiate NAFTA, but did neither. Stephen Harper, who having promised he would appoint no one who was not elected to either cabinet or the Senate, on his first day as Prime Minister appointed his election organizer Michael Fortier to both. A pattern that was to be repeated in everything from fixed election dates to the taxation of income trusts. These were not, it must be stressed, casual slips of the lip. They were central planks in each of these gentlemen's platforms, in some cases arguably the key to their victory. Each time such a lie is exposed, the politicians are forced to go to even greater lengths to get people to believe the next one. And the harder it becomes after that for the public to trust in anyone or to base their vote on anything. The problem is not so much that liars are prospering as that honest politicians, and they do exist, have no way of establishing their bona fides. So discredited is the profession generally that everyone is disbelieved equally. A second related issue is attack ads. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with politicians criticizing one another, going negative in the vernacular. But it matters how you go about it, whether your aim is to engage the public or to inflame them. Tone matters, as does truth. Truth not merely in the sense of factual correctness, but fairness, proportion, context. These are not qualities, needless to say, that we associate with attack ads. Their point is not to criticize, but to inflame. They're not trying to provoke thought, they're trying to shut it down. The result is not merely to damage one party or the other, the whole profession is degraded to the point that people tune out of politics altogether. The comparison has been made many times. If the airlines ran attack ads savaging each other's safety records, nobody would fly on any of them. Indeed, politics looks very much like an industry in decline. If any normal industry were experiencing the sort of catastrophic drop in turnout numbers that politics is, they'd be turning themselves inside out, trying to figure out, what are we doing wrong? Only in politics is such a galloping disaster treated as business as usual. Of course, it's not all darkness and rain in the modern campaign. There are always those signature events, the televised leaders' debates. There's something just a little bit disturbing about deciding an election not even on the basis of what was learned in the brief chaos of a 5-week campaign, but purely on the strength of who won or who lost on a single night in a debate. We're electing a government, not a high school debating champion. Don't get me wrong, debates can be valuable opportunities to compare and contrast the leaders and their platforms. But that's a very different thing than what the debates have become, which is simply a prize fight. The candidates are encouraged to go toe-to-toe, to mix it up, in hopes of that holy grail of media moments, the knockout blow. Of course, if you read the coverage afterwards, there's never a knockout blow. Or as Rick Salutin once said, when the media complain there were no knockout blows, what they really mean is there were no usable clips. Why have the debates so full of promise become such wastes of time? Because we have left the design of them to last-minute ad hoc negotiations between the networks and the parties. Vested interests, every one of them. The party ahead in the polls wants to have none. The party behind in the polls wants to have 18. They saw it off at 1. Or rather 1 in each language. This curious segregation, observed nowhere else in our national politics, in practice means one debate for the rest of the country and one whose sole focus is Quebec. We're quite used to simultaneous translation in this country. Why on earth do we put up with this? I alluded to the media's role, and I'd be remiss if I did not dwell on that a bit, because we make an invaluable contribution to ruining virtually every election that comes our way. We can't help ourselves, it seems. After every election, we retire defeated to our newsroom postmortems, and each time we vow, never again. Never again will we sit up and beg for our Gainsburgers, the little meaningless morsels of news the parties dole out each day to keep us complicit in their charades. Never again will we chase after every fleeting poll, salivate over every minor gaffe. Never again the gotcha question, the silly photo op, the constant search for defining moments and turning points, the investing of trivial campaign mishaps with symbolic, metaphoric import. And then we go out and do it all over again. The question, I submit, that most voters would like answered in the course of any campaign is, who are these people and what are they going to do to us? Oh, all right, for us, if you will. What instead do we tell them? We tell them who's ahead and who's behind. And then we tell them who's ahead and who's behind. After a while, we tell them who's still ahead and who's still behind. Eventually, we descend on whoever's behind and we ask them why they're behind. Over and over and over. Why are you behind? Why won't you admit you're behind? Why are you such a loser? If you were a tree, what kind of loser tree would you be? Apparently in the hope that if we keep at it long enough, we might be able to make them cry. When that gets boring, we speculate on whether whoever's ahead in the race can stay ahead, and whatever space we have left over, we devote to the strategists. Read the coverage of any major daily on any given day of a campaign, watch the television. It's not about the election, it's about the campaign. The strategies, the tactics, how an issue is framed, whether so-and-so needs to pivot, and so on. Because in his secret heart of hearts, that's who the journalist wishes he was, one of the players, the guys in the room. We write about the horse race not because it matters to our readers, but because it matters to the pros, the people we cover, the people we idolize. We parrot their language even as we absorb their values. The latest campaign ad is analyzed from any number of angles. Will it work? Is it on message? What will it mean for the brand? Everything except the most obvious. Is it true? But even if we had the most perfect election campaigns, we would still have to reckon with the carnage wreaked by our antiquated, unrepresentative, divisive electoral system, first past the post, where the plurality, not the majority, wins. Every election throws up fresh anomalies from this dreadful system. Take an example. 2006, the NDP, with 2.6 million votes, got 29 seats. The Bloc Québécois, with 1.6 million, got 51 seats. The Greens, with more than 650,000 votes, got 0 seats. Liberals in the West, Tories in our biggest cities, Federalists in Quebec, all have been systematically and greatly underrepresented, distorting our perception of the country and needlessly aggravating regional tensions. Combine that with the vast disparities in the number of voters per riding, and it takes as many votes to elect one Tory MP in some Alberta ridings as it takes to elect 5 Liberal MPs in PEI and Labrador. The fundamental promise of democracy is one person, one vote. A system in which one person's vote is worth 3 times or 4 times or 5 times another's, depending on which party they vote for and which riding they live in, is only approximately democratic. Indeed, for most voters, their votes are effectively worth nothing at all. If you vote for anyone but the winning candidate in our system, and that would be over half of the voters in a typical election, you're effectively denied representation. In a multi-candidate race, the winner might romp home with the support of 30% of the voters or less. That same trend is then aggregated over all of the ridings to produce majority quote-unquote governments with the support of less than 40% of the vote, who then go on to claim 100% of the power. Worse, voters are constantly told they cannot vote for the candidate they prefer lest they split the vote. Rather, they must vote for some other candidate they dislike in order to prevent some third candidate they dislike even less, even more, from winning. And that's, of course, unless they live in a safe seat, in which case there's really no point in voting at all. But the worst effect of first past the vote isn't even felt on election day. It's every day in between. It's the incentives it creates for certain types of perverse political behavior. The most important thing to know about first past the vote post is that it's highly leveraged. That is to say, not only do the party's representation in the legislature bear no resemblance to their respective shares of the popular vote, but tiny swings in the vote lead to exponentially larger swings in electoral outcomes. Finding and mobilizing those votes, the swing voters in the swing ridings, is thus a matter of huge consequence to the parties. So we get long periods when no party takes any position at all for fear of alienating the swings, punctuated by wild frenzies of wedge issues. We call these elections. Thank you. We call these elections. Well, then after the election, votes are cast and counted and Parliament resumes sitting. At which point most of us are moved to ask, what on earth was that all about? That's how irrelevant Parliament has become. What do we elect MPs to do? Examine legislation? Yeah, well, not when dozens of laws of vastly differing purpose can be bundled together into omnibus bills, hundreds of pages of law, the whole of the government's spring or fall agenda in one bill, leaving scant hours to study any individual piece and leaving it impossible to know what Parliament intended when it voted on 65 bills at the same time. Debate. The arguments are rote, attendance is sparse, no one's mind has been changed for 60 years. That's when debate is even permitted and not, as has happened 50 times in this session alone, curtailed by a government motion of time allocation. Those of you who remember your history will remember the pipeline debate of 1956, one of the great parliamentary brawls of Canadian history, went on for weeks, great speeches, great emotions. That was set off because the government had invoked closure, it cut off debate in peacetime. And people said, oh my, they can't do that, they can't shut off debate. Now it happens every other week and nobody bats an eye. Indeed, as we were reminded last spring, MPs cannot even ask questions in the House or make routine member statements. I said again, members' statements without the permission of the party whips and indeed without having them scripted by the party central command. Okay, well maybe we elect MPs to vote in the House. Well, Canada has, experts agree, among the strictest systems of party discipline in the democratic or indeed the undemocratic world, affording individual MPs the least leeway to vote as their conscience or their constituents dictate. Not for nothing are MPs sometimes referred to as $160,000 voting machines. So that is what we elect MPs to do. That is an MP's lot, to do as they are told, speak as they are told, vote as they are told. Parliament is simply not the place where important matters are debated, decided, or even announced these days. It has become, indeed, a largely ceremonial body, a glorified electoral college. Well, how did it come to this? The answer lies not so much in the formal rules of the game as in the relative powers of the players. MPs are weak in the main because their leaders are too strong. Without redressing that imbalance, nothing much will change. Simply allowing more free votes, as you sometimes hear suggested, would do little on its own. Free votes, as things stand, are never truly free. The date when party leaders began to get the upper hand over their caucuses can be marked with some precision. It traces back to the 1919 Liberal National Convention that chose Mackenzie King as its leader in convention. Previously, party leaders in Canada had been chosen as they are in the classic Westminster model, still enforced in Australia, for example, by a vote of the caucus. As they were made, so they could be unmade. In such a system, even prime ministers can be removed by caucus at any time, as Margaret Thatcher was, as Australia's Kevin Rudd was, and as his successor, Julia Gillard, was in her term. It's not hard to see how this would make a party leader a little more attentive to the concerns of ordinary MPs. By contrast, a leader in possession of a mandate from the membership at large is free to thumb his nose at the caucus for long periods at a stretch. In extraordinary cases, after much time, effort, and acrimony, by a process with no known rules, timetables, or even any agreed upon means of settling the question, it is true, a leader can be forced out by his MPs, or as we've seen at the provincial level, by his or her MLAs or MNAs. But who wants to go through that torment, especially knowing that even if you succeed, even if you somehow, by this Byzantine process, take down the leader, the result is not a quick sounding of caucus, but another months-long ordeal, this time to pick a new leader. All of which makes the present system, the present ability of caucus to discipline the leader, basically the atom bomb of political maneuver, so awful as to be of little use. Whereas Thatcher was replaced in 4 days. But that is only one side of the equation. If the leader dominates caucus, it's not only because they do not choose him or her, it's because he almost literally chooses them. In Canada, as a matter of law, no candidate may run for Parliament under a party banner without the signature of the leader on his or her nomination papers. This gives the leader an absolute veto over the nomination of every member of caucus, real or prospective, and not only their original nomination, but if they want to get renominated, which means get out of line and you'll never work in this town again. Of course, even if MPs did not need the leader's signature on their nomination papers, they would still have ample reason to follow his dictates. Ambition is the real party whip, commanding obedience where mere threats might not. This is especially true on the government side, given the extraordinary range of offices and favors that are in the Prime Minister's power to bestow. Consider the powers of appointment of a Canadian Prime Minister. He appoints the Governor General. He appoints the Senators. He appoints every member of the Supreme Court and all the federal court judges too. He appoints the Clerk of the Privy Council, every Deputy Minister, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, the heads of all of the major Crown corporations, all of the ambassadors. He appoints the Chief of the RCMP, those independent officers of Parliament like the Auditor General, the Information, Privacy and Ethics Commissioners. He appoints them too, and all with very little oversight, consultation, or scrutiny. Most important, he appoints the Cabinet. At 39 ministers, we have the largest cabinet in the democratic world, or indeed the undemocratic world, much larger than any comparable country. The President of the United States of America is able to get by with a cabinet of just 15. The Prime Minister of Japan or the Chancellor of Germany, roughly the same. Britain, Australia, and New Zealand all have cabinets with fewer than 24 ministers. Why does Canada need twice as many? We didn't always. Sir John A. Macdonald governed with only 12. Mackenzie King fought a world war and a depression with 16. As late as Louis Saint Laurent, there were still fewer than 20. Even Pierre Trudeau didn't push it above 30. And yet somehow we're coasting at near 40. What does this mean? It means that given a typical majority governing caucus of 160 to 180 MPs, the MP who keeps his nose clean has at least a 1 in 4 chance of making it to cabinet. Compare that to Britain, where you've got a caucus of 400 odd and a cabinet of 20, where it's more like 1 in 20 odds. Throw in the many parliamentary secretaries and committee chairs, and yes, the Prime Minister appoints all of them too, and just about every member of caucus is in line for some sort of reward, or thinks he is. And that's just the start. Prime Minister alone decides, for example, when to dissolve Parliament and call fresh elections. Coupled with the power of the Prime Minister alone to declare any vote a matter of confidence, he effectively has a gun to the heads of any members on either side of the Commons who might be tempted to defeat a government bill. So consider the plight of the opposition, whose job ostensibly is to hold the government to account. I mean, it's supposed to be the job of government MPs as well, but they've long ago forgotten that idea. You know, it used to be the case, just as a little aside, this is not generally known, but up until World War II, and I'm not saying we should go back to this, but it's just a lovely portrait of what we've lost. It used to be the case that if you were appointed to cabinet, and I mean as a member of the governing party, you had to resign your seat and run in a by-election. Why? Because your role had changed. You'd gone from being a watchdog on the government as a member of the governing caucus. You'd gone from being a watchdog on the government to a member of it. You crossed over to the executive, and you had to go back to your electors and ask their permission. Now, it had its problems as a policy. If you had a very narrow majority and you appointed a cabinet, you would sometimes lose your majority. Times in Canadian history, critical times in history, where this played havoc with the plans of the government of the day. So I'm not saying we should go back to it, but I sure as hell love the concept and the belief system behind it. Anyway, back to where I was talking about. Imagine you're on the opposition benches and you're trying to hold the government to account. Well, they can't get their questions answered in question period, even when ministers bother to take them. Somehow they're allowed to slough them off onto somebody else. They can't get the documents they demand, Parliament's undoubted power to compel documents, which is what that whole motion of contempt was about a couple of years back. When they do, they can't sometimes trust the figures in them, as we saw with the F-35 debacle. And on those rare occasions when the government is finally being held to account, when it really comes under close scrutiny, when its feet are at last being held to the fire, it prorogues for months at a time. In some provinces, naming no British Columbias, the legislature has taken to sitting for less than 2 months of the year. Well, I know what you're thinking. There's still the Confidence Convention, the bedrock parliamentary convention that a government must at all times command the support of a majority of members of Parliament. Really? Tell it to Stephen Harper, who prorogued in 2008 rather than face a confidence vote he was sure to lose. Tell it to Paul Martin, who lost a confidence vote in 2005, then spent the next 9 days trawling the opposition benches, offering jobs and other inducements that he was not constitutionally empowered to bestow in order to win a do-over vote. Well, it's only a convention. Like ministerial responsibility, like cabinet solidarity and all the rest of the conventions of the Westminster system, it held effect for as long as governments felt like being bound by it. And as they no longer do, it doesn't. To recap, a party in the grip of a single leader and his coterie of advisors, though it offers little in the way of a serious platform and differs hardly at all with its main opposition, is nevertheless able by a combination of false promises, venomous attack ads, and media blunders to stampede a little over a third of the electorate or a fifth of the adult population into supporting it, which when processed through the vote splits and other funhouse arithmetic of the first-past-the-post electoral system is magically transformed into a majority. Thus empowered, the Prime Minister ruled with something approaching dictatorial powers for 4 or 5 years, until at a time of his choosing, the process is repeated. This is what our democracy has become. How can we fix this? I wish we could. I have a number of suggestions, which I'll go through quickly because they're unlikely ever to be implemented. Number one, we need a Truth in Politics Act. If a company lies to consumers about its products, it faces stiff fines or worse. Likewise, an investment prospectus cannot be false or even misleading. There are laws against libel and slander. Even politicians are forbidden to lie in certain circumstances. They can't lie to each other, at least in Parliament, or about each other, a provision in the election laws of Canada and 8 of the provinces. But lie to the public about a major campaign promise, all part of the game. Well, to be sure, free and feisty political debates are critical to a democracy, and I certainly do not propose any sort of speech regulation. But the problem remains. It's not so much as, again, as I said, that liars are prospering, as that honest politicians have no way of establishing their bona fides. So what I propose is this, not a ban on political lying, but rather to let politicians opt in to legal liability if the claims they are making prove false, rather as people do in private life. From bonded couriers to sworn affidavits, people have found ways to show that they're trustworthy when it's very difficult to do so, by willingly assuming certain penalties if they're not. Suppose then there were a provision of the Elections Act which a candidate could invoke at his discretion, and I stress this, at his discretion, to cover particular statements or documents with provisions for fines or other sanctions if they're found to be materially false. No gotchas over some stray slip of the lip on the campaign trail, but when they really needed to be believed, they'd have some means of persuading people they were on the level. And over time, I have a feeling opting in would become the norm rather than the exception. 2, to deal with attack ads. Again, I'm not proposing any regulation except this. Make the leaders voice the ads. You know, what they do now is the leader takes something approaching the high road, wanders about the country, says, I have nothing against my opponent's patriotism, whatever, but he's wrong on this. And meanwhile, his minions are doing the dirty work with the ads, and he's got kind of plausible deniability. Oh, it's, you know, it's them. Make the leader voice the ads, and you collapse that distinction. Imagine if, and I'll pick on Stephen Harper for a minute, imagine if instead of the Conservatives writing those ads with those people they hire with the perpetual sneer in their voices, to say that, you know, Michael Ignatieff, he didn't come after you. Imagine if Harper had to say it. I think you would see it dry up in a hurry, because no leader wants to be tainted with that kind of garbage. Number 3, very simply, cut their funding. You know, there's never been cheaper to run an election campaign in the history of the world. We've got mass media now, you know, online email blasts, viral videos, etc., that cost zero. It's never been easier to reach people, and yet we've never had more money in politics, and most of it is for stuff that hurts democracy. It goes to push polls and attack ads and robocalls and all this stuff that we don't actually need and doesn't really help. It's vastly overgenerous. The only reason any of them need any of the money, frankly, is because all the other ones do. It's an arms race. So fine, cut them all back. We wouldn't miss it. 4th, let's fix the debate system. As I said, these can be extremely valuable. Imagine if, instead of leaving it to that last-minute ad hoc negotiations, we set the rules for the debates in the election laws so that people didn't know where they were going to be at the polls. It's the old veil of ignorance idea. They didn't know where they were going to be in the polls. You could arrange something and agree to something, I think, that would be fair to all. And imagine if we had, to be optimistic about it, if instead of having one debate in each language, supposing we arranged our elections along a spine of weekly debates. Weekly debates. Imagine we took elections as serious businesses for exchanging the differences between the parties rather than a trail of meaningless photo ops. If nothing else, it would give us in the media something to do. Because I promise you, we can't fix ourselves. But if we had something to write about other than the Gainsburgers, if there was either a debate that had just finished or a debate that was coming up, and we could have each debate could be on a different subject, we could actually have, I think, something approaching, dare I say it, a civilized election campaign. 5th, proportional representation. And I'm not going to bore you with all the different types of models. I'm just saying to you the basics of it are this, that every vote in every riding would count the same. There would be no more safe ridings. There would be no more split votes or demands that people engage in strategic voting. There would be no more crazy winner-take-all politics because the leverage would have been taken out of the system. There wouldn't be 2% of the vote that mattered much more than the other 98%. Every vote would matter equally. Cut the size of the cabinet. I won't go into that detail there, but I promise you could cut a third of the current retinue and no one would even notice. Limit confidence motions to those explicitly designated as such by the mover. Subject the power to dissolve or prorogue to a vote of the House, rather than simply being in the purview of the Prime Minister. Give the Speaker more power, as the Speaker enjoys in the UK Parliament, to decide who speaks when in Parliament, for example, or when to limit debate, rather than leaving it to an obvious self-interested party, the government of the day. Last and most important, pass Michael Chong's Reform Act in the House of Commons. For those of you who are not familiar, the two really key ingredients are the ones I was talking about. One is to remove the power that the leader now holds over every candidate of having to have his signature on their papers, to take that power away from the leader and give the power to the caucus, conversely, to decide when to fire the leader. And I would add to that the power to hire the leader, as in the classic Westminster model, but Chong's bill doesn't go that far. If you restore the right of caucus to hire and fire the leader, you go a long way on its own to making MPs relevant again. And if that sounds less democratic than the current practice, I think that's just a tribute to how far we have devalued the role of MPs. If we thought MPs mattered, if we thought they were serious figures in our democracy, if we thought Parliament mattered, then we would want the leader of a party to be the leader of that caucus, to be chosen by that caucus, because we would think that a big job of the leader was to lead that caucus in this important place called Parliament, not to go out and fundraise and make speeches at places 100,000 miles away. These things become kind of self-reinforcing circles where the more degraded the MP's role becomes, the less willing we are to give them serious responsibilities. But just as a matter of basic democratic principle, democracy is about consent of the governed. What do we do when we choose a leader right now? We have somebody one group of people meets in a hockey arena somewhere and chooses the leader, if it's on the old convention system, where now it's a bunch of people sitting in their basements. In the last case, in the last Liberal Party, they're not even members of the party. Most of them have vanished. The party doesn't know who they are or where they are. So that group of people picks the leader, who then crosses the street or goes down the road and enters Parliament and says to the group of MPs there, I am now your boss. You didn't choose me, some other group did, but I will now hold your career in my hands. It's outrageous when you think about it. That's an assault on Parliament. That's not legitimate. It's not a legitimate role for some private group to be deciding what goes on in our Parliament, our public Parliament. We're ordinary members to decide collectively, and that's what it's going to be if the Chong Bill is going to be passed. It's going to depend upon MPs standing up for themselves. We're ordinary members to decide they were no longer willing to be treated as they have. They could force the issue. And it's going to be a big test for MPs because that's not how they've been conditioned to behave. Those of an independent bent are unlikely to be selected as nominees in the first place. If they do manage to make it through to Parliament, they face enormous pressure to be team players, pressure not only from the leader, but from their fellow caucus members. And each incursion on their prerogatives has habituated them to accept the next. And yet, if ever a start were to be made, it would surely create the platform from which to argue for more. The current downward spiral would be reversed. This is the importance. This is why the Reform Act is so important. It's not going to cure everything that's wrong with our democracy. I had a long list, as you may have noticed. But it's a starting point. It gets the ball rolling. Once the balance between party leaders and the caucus is restored to its proper place, then I think that makes possible other reforms that are currently impossible. But even then, nothing will really change if we, the voters, don't pay attention. If we don't fan the flames of democratic reform. The problem is, we've lived without a functioning Parliament for so long, it doesn't occur to us what we've lost. We have to look past the Parliament that is to the Parliament that could be. We have to see what a remarkable thing it is, this little playhouse where the life of the nation is acted out each day. We have to understand that this is our house and MPs are us. No other body represents all of us rather than just some of us. And as such, no other body can perform quite the same function as Parliament. Without it, the government would have a monopoly on the people's business. There would be no mechanism for forcing other issues and ideas onto the national agenda, nor any means of representing the particular interests and concerns of the people of each riding. It is, at the same time, the only forum in this godforsaken country where all of our many regions and interests and identities are forced to reckon with each other, to balance their own needs against those of the rest. It's the only body to whom the government is constitutionally obliged to answer, and not occasionally or at its pleasure, but every day. It is what enables us to hold the government to account, not just at election time every 4 years, but all the time. If we understood this more fully, we would be less tolerant of seeing the people who represent us treated with such contempt, because it is we who are thereby insulted. I've forgotten somebody, haven't I? Yes, the media. If ever MPs are to be released from the irons of party discipline, we journalists have to stop assisting their wardens. We have to stop running around as if the world were coming to an end every time an MP departs from the party line. The story there is not party divided. The story is MP does job. And who knows, maybe one day that'll no longer be considered news. To save our democracy, our broken democracy, we have to restore public faith in the political process. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It is broke. Let's fix it. Thank you very much.